On a crisp autumn morning, when most teenagers were still buried under their warm blankets, Alex was already tying his worn-out sneakers, getting ready for his morning shift at Wilson's grocery. The familiar smell of his mom's coffee and toast filled their small apartment as he grabbed his blue work vest from the coat rack. "Don't forget your lunch," his mom called out from the kitchen, her voice carrying that special warmth that only moms seem to have. She was already dressed in her nurse's uniform, ready for her own long day ahead. Alex couldn't help but smile at how she still treated him like a kid sometimes, even though he'd been working part-time for nearly a year now. The early morning streets were quiet as Alex walked to work, his breath visible in the cool air. He passed by the same familiar sights: old Mrs. Lee watering her prized roses, the local bakery just starting to fill the air with the scent of fresh bread, and the newspaper stand where Mr. Kumar was arranging the day's headlines. Wilson's grocery wasn't anything fancy, just your typical neighborhood store with slightly squeaky floors and fluorescent lights that sometimes flickered in the freezer section. But to Alex, it was more than just a workplace. It was where he'd learned responsibility, earned money for college, and most importantly, where he found a second family among his coworkers. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar ding of the bell announced his arrival. "Right on time as always," smiled Rita, the elderly cashier who'd been working there longer than Alex had been alive. She was arranging penny candy jars at the counter, something she did every morning with the precision of an artist. Alex started his usual routine, checking inventory, restocking shelves, and making sure the produce section looked fresh and inviting. He had a system down pat: start with the vegetables, move to the fruits, and finish with the herbs. While working, he mentally rehearsed his college application essay. He wanted to write about his parents' journey from their home country, how they'd built a life from scratch, and how their determination had shaped his own dreams. As he carefully arranged red apples in a perfect pyramid, a skill that had taken months to master, he overheard two regular customers chatting about their grandchildren. It made him think about his own grandparents, who he only knew through old photographs and stories his parents shared during dinner. He wondered what they would think of him now, working in an American grocery store, planning for college, living a life so different from what they might have imagined. The morning sunlight started streaming through the store's large front windows, creating patterns on the freshly mopped floor. Regular customers began trickling in, the early birds who preferred shopping when the store was quiet. Alex greeted each one with a genuine smile, not the forced kind that some retail workers wear like a uniform. He was just about to take his morning break when an unfamiliar elderly man walked through the doors, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. There was something distinguished about him, despite his simple clothing. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or perhaps the kind wrinkles around his eyes that suggested a lifetime of smiling. Little did Alex know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but ordinary. As he watched the elderly man make his way to the cereal aisle, he had no idea that both their lives were about to change forever. Sometimes the biggest moments in life start on the most normal of days, in the most ordinary of places. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the cash register chimed in the background, and somewhere in the store, a new chapter was about to begin in both their stories. The morning had been moving along smoothly until Alex heard a soft thud coming from the cereal aisle. At first, he thought someone had knocked over a box of cornflakes. It happened all the time. But then he heard something that made his heart skip: the sound of labored breathing. Running around the corner, Alex found the elderly man he'd noticed earlier hunched over his shopping cart, his face pale and twisted in pain. A box of oatmeal lay spilled at his feet, but that was the least of anyone's concerns. The man was clutching his chest, trying to speak, but only managing short, desperate gasps. Alex's mind raced back to the first aid certification course he'd taken last summer. His mom had insisted he take it. "You never know when you might need to help someone," she'd said. Now, standing in the middle of the cereal aisle with a man possibly having a heart attack, her words echoed in his head. "Sir, can you hear me?" Alex asked clearly, trying to keep his voice steady despite his pounding heart. The elderly man managed a weak nod. Without hesitation, Alex turned to Rita, who had appeared at the end of the aisle. "Call 911 now," he shouted, his voice carrying an authority he didn't know he possessed. Time seemed to slow down. Alex helped the man to the ground, making sure he didn't hit his head. The cold linoleum floor of Wilson's grocery had become an emergency room, and Alex, a teenager who usually spent his mornings stocking shelves, was now fighting to save a life. "Stay with me, sir," Alex kept talking, remembering how his instructor had emphasized the importance of maintaining communication. "Help is on the way. Can you squeeze my hand?" The man's grip was weak but present. A good sign, Alex thought. When the man's eyes started to close, Alex knew he had to act. He practiced CPR on a dummy, but this was different. This was a real person, someone's father, maybe someone's grandfather. Alex positioned his hands on the man's chest, just as he'd been taught, and began compressions. The store had gone eerily quiet. Regular customers stood frozen in the aisles, watching as this young employee performed CPR with the focus of a seasoned professional. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alex counted in his head, trying to maintain the rhythm his instructor had drilled into them. The man's expensive watch caught the fluorescent light with each compression, a reminder that time was precious. What felt like hours was actually only minutes before the wail of sirens cut through the morning air. The paramedics burst through the doors with their equipment, their boots squeaking on the freshly mopped floor. They took over smoothly, their practiced movements making Alex's efforts seem amateur in comparison. "Good job, kid," one of the paramedics said as they loaded the elderly man onto a stretcher. "You probably saved his life." Those were textbook compressions. Alex stood there, his work vest wrinkled and his hands shaking slightly, watching as they wheeled the man toward the ambulance. As the excitement died down and customers began to return to their shopping, Alex felt the weight of what had just happened sink in. His legs felt wobbly, and he sat down on a nearby stack of water bottle cases. Rita brought him a cup of water from the break room, patting his shoulder with grandmotherly affection. "You're a hero, you know that," she said softly. But Alex didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a teenager who'd done what anyone would do, what anyone should do. As he sipped the water, his hands still trembling slightly, he had no idea that this was just the beginning of an incredible story. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of congratulations from customers and concerned questions from coworkers. But something kept nagging at him. Something about the elderly man had seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was just his imagination, or maybe it was the universe's way of telling him that their paths were meant to cross. As Alex hung up his vest at the end of his shift, he had no clue that in just 24 hours, this seemingly simple act of heroism would unlock a door to a past he never knew existed, changing not just his life, but the lives of everyone he loved. By the time Alex got home that evening, the local news vans were already parked outside his apartment building. Someone at the store had posted a video of his quick action on social media, and it had spread like wildfire through their small community. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from friends and classmates who'd seen the footage. His mom was waiting at the door, still in her nurse's uniform, having rushed home early after hearing what happened. She pulled him into a tight hug the moment he stepped inside. "My brave boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. His dad stood nearby, trying to maintain his usual calm demeanor, but Alex could see the pride shining in his eyes. "The hospital called," his dad said, clearing his throat. "The man you helped, he's stable. They said if you hadn't acted so quickly." He trailed off, but the message was clear. A life had been saved because of those first aid classes they'd insisted Alex take last summer. The evening news ran the story at 6 o'clock. The family gathered around their small TV, watching as shaky cell phone footage showed Alex performing CPR in the cereal aisle. It felt surreal seeing himself on screen, like watching someone else's life. The reporter called him a local hero, and an example of youth rising to the occasion. "That's not even the best part," his mom said, reaching for a tissue. "The nurses at my hospital know him, the man you saved. He's quite well known in the community. His name is Mr. Thompson, and he's done so much for the local children's hospital." As they sat eating dinner, his mom had made his favorite noodles to celebrate. Their doorbell kept ringing. Neighbors dropped by with homemade cookies and cards, each wanting to congratulate the young hero in their building. Mrs. Chen from the 4th floor brought her famous dumplings, saying between happy tears that her own grandson had been treated at the children's hospital Mr. Thompson supported. Alex felt overwhelmed by all the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. He was just a regular kid who worked at a grocery store and dreamed about college. But something his dad said stuck with him. Sometimes the biggest moments in life come disguised as ordinary days. Later that night, as Alex was helping with the dishes, the house phone rang. His mom answered it, and her expression changed as she listened. She handed the phone to Alex with slightly shaking hands. "It's the hospital again. Mr. Thompson wants to speak with you." Alex dried his hands on a kitchen towel and took the phone, his heart beating a little faster. "Hello." The voice on the other end was warm and steady. Nothing like the desperate gasps he'd heard in the store. "Young man," Mr. Thompson said, "I believe I owe you my life." There was something about his voice that seemed familiar, but Alex couldn't quite place it. They talked for a few minutes, with Mr. Thompson asking about Alex's life, his plans for college, his family. But then the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Your mother's maiden name," Mr. Thompson said carefully, "would it happen to be Lee?" Alex confirmed it was, wondering how he knew. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a deep breath. "I need to tell you something," Mr. Thompson said, his voice now carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Something about your grandfather, your mother's father." The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Alex's mom was watching him intently, trying to read his expression. His dad had stopped pretending to read the newspaper. Even the usual street noise outside their window seemed to have died down, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "Could you and your family come to the hospital tomorrow?" Mr. Thompson asked. "There's a story you need to hear. A story that started long before today, in a different country, in a different time." As Alex hung up the phone and looked at his parents' questioning faces, he had no idea that the real story was just beginning. The heart attack in the grocery store wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a tale that would unravel decades of family history, buried secrets, and forgotten connections. The next morning felt different. Alex and his parents walked through the hospital corridors, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The news coverage from the previous day was playing silently on a waiting room TV, showing clips of the grocery store incident. It felt like watching a movie about someone else's life. His mom was unusually quiet. She'd barely touched her breakfast, and Alex had noticed her hands fidgeting with her purse strap, something she only did when she was nervous. His dad kept a steady hand on her shoulder, whispering reassuring words in their native language. Room 315. The number on the door seemed to stare back at them. Inside, Mr. Thompson sat upright in his hospital bed, looking remarkably better than he had in the grocery store. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the silver in his hair. Several get-well cards decorated his bedside table, along with a small photo frame facing away from the door. "Come in, please," Mr. Thompson smiled, gesturing to the chairs beside his bed. His voice was stronger now, carrying a warmth that filled the room. But when his eyes met Alex's mom's face, something changed. Both adults froze, like people seeing ghosts in broad daylight. "You look just like him," Mr. Thompson whispered, his eyes glistening. "Just like your father." Alex watched as his mom sank into the nearest chair, her face a mixture of confusion and recognition. You? You knew my father?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson reached for the photo frame on his bedside table. With slightly shaking hands, he turned it around. There, in a slightly faded photograph, were two young men standing in front of what looked like an old office building. One was clearly a younger Mr. Thompson. The other? Grandpa, Alex breathed, recognizing the face from the few family photos they had. "Your grandfather and I weren't just business partners," Mr. Thompson began, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "We were best friends. We started our technology company together in 1985, two young men with big dreams and bigger ideas." The story spilled out like water from a broken dam. How they'd met at a technology conference in Hong Kong. How they'd stayed up late into the night, sketching designs on napkins and dreaming of changing the world. Their company had started in a tiny office, but their innovative ideas quickly gained attention. "We were on the verge of something big," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice catching. "A new type of computer chip, something that could have revolutionized the industry. But then came the patent dispute." Alex's mom let out a small gasp. She'd been very young when it all happened, but she remembered the arguments, the tension, the day her father had packed up his office and returned to China, never to speak of this time in America again. "The truth is," Mr. Thompson said, pulling out an old envelope from his bedside drawer, "it was all a misunderstanding. I tried to reach out, to explain, but pride got in the way. On both sides." The envelope contained old documents, patent applications, letters, emails, evidence that both men had independently developed similar ideas, neither stealing from the other. But in the heat of the moment, surrounded by lawyers and accusations, their friendship had shattered like dropped glass. "Yesterday, when you saved my life," Mr. Thompson looked at Alex, "I didn't know who you were. But when I heard your last name, when I saw your face, I knew this was more than coincidence. This was a second chance." The hospital room fell quiet. Outside, life went on. Nurses chatted, phones rang, visitors walked past. But inside room 315, time seemed to stand still as decades of misunderstanding began to unravel. Mr. Thompson reached for another envelope, this one newer. "I want to make things right," he said. "Your grandfather isn't here anymore for me to apologize to, but perhaps I can help his grandson achieve his dreams." Alex's parents exchanged glances. The story wasn't over. It was just taking an unexpected turn. And somewhere, Alex thought, his grandfather must be watching, perhaps finally understanding the truth that took 30 years to come to light. In the days that followed, the story of the past unfolded piece by piece, like an old photograph slowly coming into focus. Alex sat in their small living room, surrounded by yellowed papers and old documents that Mr. Thompson had shared. Each page revealed another chapter of a story he never knew was part of his family's history. His mom spent hours translating old letters his grandfather had written in Chinese. Some were business documents, but others were personal, hopes, dreams, and eventually, heartbreak. "Your grandfather wasn't just creating technology," she explained, wiping tears from her eyes. "He was trying to build a bridge between two worlds." The company they had built, originally called Future Tech Solutions, had started in a tiny office above a Chinese restaurant. Mr. Thompson had brought the business experience, while Alex's grandfather had been the technical genius. Together, they'd worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and dreams of changing the world. "Look at this," his dad said, holding up an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local tech startup revolutionizes computer industry." The black and white photo showed two young men grinning at the camera, standing in front of their first real office. They looked so happy, so unaware of what lay ahead. The patent dispute had started innocently enough. Both men had been working on similar ideas, a new type of computer chip that could process information faster than anything available at the time. In the rush of creativity and innovation, they hadn't properly documented who had developed which parts. Alex found an old prototype in one of the boxes Mr. Thompson had sent over. It was smaller than his palm, covered in dust, but he could see why it had been so special. His grandfather's handwriting was still visible on the casing. Tiny Chinese characters that his mom said meant dream maker. The lawyers got involved. His mom read from another letter, her voice quiet. Suddenly, everyone was talking about intellectual property rights and corporate espionage. Your grandfather couldn't bear the thought of being called a thief. His honor meant everything to him. There were pictures of trade shows where they'd presented their ideas, business cards from potential investors, and even a half-finished patent application with both their names on it. But the most heartbreaking items were the unsent letters. Once his grandfather had written to Mr. Thompson, but never mailed. I wish I could explain. One letter read in careful English. The ideas came to me in dreams, just as they came to you. We were both right, and we were both wrong. But now there are too many angry words between us. Mr. Thompson had his own collection of unmailed letters. I tried to reach out, he told them in the hospital. But every time I picked up the phone, I remembered the hurt in your father's eyes when the accusations started flying. Pride is a terrible thing. It makes us forget what really matters. The technology they'd fought over had eventually been developed by other companies. The computer industry had moved on, leaving their dispute behind in the pages of history. But the human cost, the broken friendship, the lost years, the pain passed down through generations, that had lingered. Alex found an old business plan, written in both English and Chinese. The final page had a note in his grandfather's handwriting. Remember, success without friendship is failure in disguise. It was dated just days before everything fell apart. His mom sat on the couch, holding a stack of photographs. I was so young when it happened, she said softly. I remember Dad coming home that last day, packing up his office things. He never talked about America again, never mentioned Mr. Thompson. But sometimes, late at night, I'd find him looking at these old pictures. As the sun set outside their apartment window, casting long shadows across the scattered papers and memories, Alex understood that he was holding more than just business documents. He was holding pieces of 2 broken hearts, 2 shattered dreams, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to heal old wounds. His phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. Mr. Thompson was being discharged tomorrow, and he had something important he wanted to discuss with all of them. Something about the future, about making things right, about turning this chance encounter into a new beginning. The next morning, sitting in Mr. Thompson's home office, Alex felt the weight of the moment. The room was filled with awards and photographs spanning decades of success, but Mr. Thompson's eyes were fixed on a plain white envelope on his desk. Your college applications, Mr. Thompson said warmly. I understand they're due soon. The question hung in the air as Alex's parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had been saving for his education since he was born, but college costs were daunting. I want to pay for your education, Mr. Thompson said simply. All of it. Any school you choose. He held up his hand as Alex's parents began to protest. Please, let me explain why. The old businessman stood up slowly, still recovering from his hospital stay, and walked to a large painting on the wall. Behind it was a safe. As he opened it, Alex could see his mom tense up. This moment felt bigger than just a scholarship offer. This, Mr. Thompson said, pulling out a folder, is what I should have shown your grandfather 30 years ago. Inside were original sketches of the computer chip design, dated and notarized, showing how both men had arrived at similar ideas through different paths. We were both right. We were both innocent. And we both let pride destroy something beautiful. Alex's mom started crying softly. His dad held her hand, his own eyes glistening. The truth, hidden for so long, was finally seeing daylight. I've lived a successful life, Mr. Thompson continued, gesturing at the awards on his walls. Made more money than I could ever spend. But I've carried this regret every single day, watching your family leave, knowing your grandfather died thinking I had betrayed him. He pulled out another document, a bank statement. The number on it made Alex's eyes widen. This was your grandfather's share of the original company. I've been adding to it for 30 years, hoping one day I'd find a way to return it. Alex's mom stood up, shaking her head. We can't accept this. It's too much. Her voice trembled with emotion. But Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. When your son saved my life in that grocery store, he said, his voice cracking slightly, I felt your father's presence. Like he was giving me one last chance to make things right. Please, let me do this. The room fell silent. Outside, birds chirped in the garden, oblivious to the heavy moment unfolding inside. Alex looked at the old photographs on Mr. Thompson's desk. Young men with big dreams, their whole lives ahead of them. I have a different idea, Alex said suddenly, surprising himself. Everyone turned to look at him. Instead of just giving us money, what if we worked together, built something new? Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up. What do you mean? I've been learning programming, working on some ideas of my own, Alex explained, gaining confidence. What if we use this money to start a new company, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it? A partnership between our families, the way it was supposed to be. The old businessman sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. A fresh start, he whispered. Your grandfather would have loved that idea. Alex's parents exchanged looks, concern mixed with pride, worry mixed with hope. His mom wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. My father always said success without friendship is failure in disguise. Then let's not fail this time, Mr. Thompson said firmly. He pulled out a blank piece of paper and picked up his pen. Tell me about your ideas, young man. As Alex began to share his thoughts, he could almost feel his grandfather's presence in the room. 2 generations later, in the same city where it all began, a new chapter was being written. Not just about business or money, but about healing, hope, and second chances. Mr. Thompson listened intently, taking notes just as he had done 30 years ago with another young dreamer from the same family. Outside his window, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the room, as if even nature was approving of this moment of reconciliation. The following weekend, Alex found himself digging through dusty boxes in his family's storage unit. His mom had remembered storing some of his grandfather's old belongings there, things they'd received after he passed away but hadn't had the heart to go through. Each box was like opening a time capsule. Old notebooks filled with his grandfather's neat handwriting, sketches of circuit boards, and detailed notes in both Chinese and English. Some pages had coffee stains and wrinkled corners, showing how many late nights had been spent working on these ideas. Look at this, his mom called out, holding up a small leather diary. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a photograph he'd never seen before. It showed his grandfather and Mr. Thompson at what looked like a Christmas party, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at some forgotten joke. This was taken the month before everything fell apart, she said softly, running her finger along the edge of the photo. They weren't just business partners. They were like brothers. As they dug deeper, they found more treasures. An old business card holder with cards printed in both languages. A set of prototype designs that looked surprisingly modern even today. And then, at the bottom of a box, they found something that made his mom gasp. It was a letter, sealed but never sent, dated just a week before his grandfather's passing. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Thompson. Alex's mom sat down on a nearby box, holding the letter like it might crumble in her hands. Should we? She hesitated, looking at Alex and his dad. His dad nodded gently. I think it's time. With careful fingers, she opened the envelope. The paper inside was thin, the handwriting shaky. written during his grandfather's final days. As she read aloud, translating from Chinese to English, tears rolled down her cheeks. "My old friend," the letter began, "as I face my final days, my thoughts keep returning to our time together. The dreams we shared, the company we built, the friendship we lost. I was too proud to admit that maybe we were both right, too stubborn to reach out when there was still time." The storage unit felt very quiet as she continued reading. Even the usual sounds of cars outside seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. "My greatest regret is not the money we lost, or the success that slipped away. It's the years of friendship we wasted, the birthday celebrations we missed, the family gatherings that should have been. I wish I could tell you that I understand now. Innovation doesn't belong to one person. Ideas can grow in two hearts at the same time, like flowers blooming in different gardens." Alex pulled out his phone and took a picture of the letter. Mr. Thompson needed to see this. The letter continued, "I'm proud of the success you've achieved. I've followed your company's growth from afar, cheering silently for each milestone. My daughter tells me you've done great things for the community, helped many people. This makes me happy. You were always the one with the bigger heart." His mom had to pause several times, her voice catching on the words. The final paragraph was the hardest to read. "If you ever meet my grandson, he would be in high school now. Please tell him this story. Tell him how two friends let pride steal their dreams. Tell him that success means nothing without the people you love beside you. And tell them I hope he's smarter than his grandfather was." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Alex thought about Mr. Thompson, sitting in his hospital bed, not knowing this letter existed. Not knowing that his old friend had wanted to make peace before the end. "We have to show him," Alex said firmly. "Tonight." His mom nodded, carefully folding the letter back into its envelope. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a bridge across time, a final message from one friend to another, a chance to finally close a chapter that had been left painfully open. As they locked up the storage unit, the setting sun cast long shadows across the ground. But for the first time in years, these shadows didn't feel like reminders of what was lost. They felt like signs pointing toward what could still be found. That evening, they sat in Mr. Thompson's living room, the letter placed carefully on the coffee table between them. The old businessman's hands shook slightly as he reached for it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. "All these years," he whispered, "I thought he died angry." The room was quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall, a sound that seemed to mark the passing of decades rather than seconds. As Mr. Thompson read the letter, tears rolled freely down his face. He reached for an old leather briefcase beside his chair, his fingers working the combination lock with practiced ease. "I have something too," he said softly. From the briefcase, he pulled out a stack of papers. Dozens of letters, all written over the years, none ever sent. Each one started the same way. "My dear friend." Every year on his birthday, Mr. Thompson explained, his voice thick with emotion, I wrote to him, telling him about my life, my regrets, asking for forgiveness. But I never had the courage to send them. Alex's mom picked up one of the letters, dated just 3 years ago. "Your daughter graduated medical school last month," she read aloud. "I saw her picture in the newspaper. She has your smile, your determination. I wanted to send flowers, but what right did I have?" The weight of unspoken words, of years lost to pride and misunderstanding, filled the room. But there was something else too, a sense of chains breaking, of old wounds finally beginning to heal. Mr. Thompson stood up slowly, walking to a painting on the wall. Behind it was a hidden safe, similar to the one in his office, but smaller. From it, he retrieved a small wooden box. "Your grandfather and I," he said, returning to his seat, "we had a tradition. Every time we solved a particularly difficult problem, we'd celebrate by sharing a cup of traditional Chinese tea." He opened the box, revealing an elegant tea set, carefully preserved. "This was the set we used. I haven't touched it since our last cup together. Alex's mom recognized it immediately. Dad used to talk about this tea set, she said softly. He said it represented the perfect blend. Chinese tradition and American innovation, just like your partnership. Mr. Thompson nodded, running his fingers along the delicate pottery. Shall we honor them both? He asked, looking at each person in the room. One last cup to close the old chapter, and then another to begin the new one. As they watched him prepare the tea with careful, practiced movements, Alex could almost see the decades melting away. For a moment, this wasn't an elderly businessman performing a ceremony. This was a young entrepreneur sharing a moment of success with his best friend. The steam rose from the cups like memories taking flight. Each person took one, holding it with both hands as Mr. Thompson had shown them. The aroma filled the room, familiar to Alex's mom, new but comforting to him and his dad. To old friends, Mr. Thompson said, raising his cup slightly. And to new beginnings. They sipped in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of grief anymore. It was the peaceful quiet of acceptance, of understanding, of healing. Your father once told me, Mr. Thompson said, looking at Alex's mom, that tea leaves never forget the water that brought them to life. Just as friends never truly forget each other, no matter how much time passes. As they finished their tea, Mr. Thompson carefully wrapped the letter in silk cloth and placed it in the wooden box alongside his own unsent letters. These belong together, he said, like we always should have been. The antique clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Outside, the city was alive with evening traffic and distant sirens, but in this room, time seemed to have found its proper place at last, acknowledging the past while embracing the future. Tomorrow, Mr. Thompson said, his eyes bright with purpose, we start working on your idea, young man. But this time, we do it right. Together, as one family. The word family hung in the air like the lingering scent of the tea, sweet, complex, and full of promise. 6 months later, the old grocery store where it all began looked very different. Alex stood outside, looking up at the newly installed sign. Future Bridge Technologies. Below it, in both English and Chinese characters, were the words Building Tomorrow's Connections Today. Inside, what used to be the storage room had been transformed into a modern office space. Computers hummed quietly, screens displayed lines of code, and on the wall hung 2 photographs side by side. One of his grandfather and Mr. Thompson from 30 years ago, and one taken just last week of their new team. Ready for the big presentation? Mr. Thompson asked, walking in with 2 cups of tea from their special set. He'd made it a tradition to share a cup before every important meeting, just like he used to do with Alex's grandfather. Alex nodded, trying to calm his nerves. In just an hour, they would be presenting their new software to potential investors. The program they developed helped connect elderly people with their families through an easy-to-use interface, inspired by all the years of lost connection in their own families. Your grandfather would be proud, Mr. Thompson said softly, placing 1 cup on Alex's desk. Not just of the business, but of how you've brought everyone together. It was true. Over the past months, something beautiful had grown from those painful memories. Alex's mom had become the company's outreach director, using her medical background to understand what elderly users needed. His dad handled the financial side, working closely with Mr. Thompson to ensure history wouldn't repeat itself. The office door opened, and several employees walked in. Young programmers Mr. Thompson had hired based on Alex's recommendations. Among them was a talented designer who'd been working part-time at the grocery store when Alex was there. She jumped at the chance to join their startup, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the team. The investors are here early, she announced, excitement in her voice. They're waiting in the conference room. Alex took a deep breath and stood up. On his desk sat the framed photo of him performing CPR that fateful day. A reminder that life's biggest changes often come when we least expect them. The presentation went better than anyone could have hoped. The investors weren't just impressed by the technology, they were moved by the story behind it. As Alex demonstrated how their software worked, showing how it could bridge distances and heal relationships, he could see tears in some of their eyes. This isn't just another tech startup. One investor said afterward, "This is something special. You're not just building software, you're building connections." Later that evening, as they celebrated in the office, Mr. Thompson raised his teacup one more time. "To the past that taught us," he said, his voice full of emotion, "and to the future we're building." Alex looked around the room, at his parents beaming with pride, at his talented team excited about their success, at Mr. Thompson who had become like a second grandfather to him. The old grocery store shelves might be gone, but something far more valuable had taken their place. On his phone, he pulled up a photo he'd taken that morning, of their company name being added to the building directory in the lobby. Below it was a small plaque that read, "Founded in honor of two friends who dreamed of changing the world together." The sun was setting outside, casting a warm glow through the office windows. Somewhere, Alex thought, his grandfather was smiling. A simple act of helping someone in need had unleashed a chain of events that had healed old wounds, united families, and created something new and beautiful. As everyone gathered for a team photo, Alex realized that success wasn't just about making money or creating innovative technology. It was about the connections we make, the bridges we build, and the love we share along the way. The camera flashed, capturing the moment, not just of a successful business launch, but of a dream reborn, a family reunited, and a legacy honored. In that flash of light, past and present merged into a bright future, proving that it's never too late for a new beginning.